Now, as always, I apologise for the slight delay in productions. It was for one reason and another. But I want to talk today about the era of Ruin, Malcador, and the new Scouring news. Now, in the wake of the siege upon Terra and the end and the death, there was a moment where the silence of the final battle between Horus and the Emperor resonated with even more power than the earth-shattering thunder that had preceded it. But all the while, Terra still burned. The ending of the Heresy and the Siege series tied together many details, but it also left us with questions unanswered. We did not see the Emperor entombed upon the Golden Throne. The traitors were still very much present, and so the era of Ruin became highly anticipated. And while I have not talked through the specific details about the Siege of Terra or the End and the Death trilogy, I have, of course, consumed them, which may then leave you to wonder, why haven't I spoken to them? And just before progressing much further today, I will, as always, note that given this material is relatively new, there are spoilers throughout this for the anthology era of Ruin. But it's been out for several weeks now, so I feel like it's okay to discuss, because it's quite a short book in the general scheme of things. Now, most often my reasoning as to why I don't always jump into these things has long been that I try to avoid getting onto new material too quickly, because I always feel that when it comes to the lore of 40k, there is near unlimited time in which to speak to something once it has been established. Also, that in 40k context is everything, and something may sit differently when it is contextualized further by adjacent or subsequent material. Then, of course, there's my standing puzzle analogy that I really don't see 40k as a linear thing, and never have, because whilst timelines are great, 40k has never really followed any kind of linear framework for its overall picture. Sure, there are series which do so, but in the collective whole, not so much. So while it might seem strange to speak to something like Era of Ruin before mentioning key material which came before, or even of course for me to really speak to figures like the Primarchs in significant detail, I've often found, and perhaps you have noticed this, that I tend to gravitate toward things which just capture a thought in my head at any given moment in time, which, for better or worse, is how my brain seems to function. Probably worse, to be honest, because I'm sure there are many algo-rich topics that I could have covered prior, but that are still on my to-do list. However, in saying that, I hope you can also perhaps appreciate that I'm still speaking from a position that is an immersive fascination rather than ticking content boxes. As I've said a lot of times now, I've always found the more interesting details personally to be in the adjacent material, the short stories, the novellas, the random sidebar quotations. Whereas the major material tends to speak to more character-driven narratives. Yes, it tells a story which sheds light, but the smaller material tends to often sit a little closer to campaign supplements in their tone and information. They fill out the space between the lines, building out the broader picture. Now, there is an additional, I think, sliver of a clue worthy of speculative discussion. And for this I cannot claim any credit at all. It goes to my good friends Kieran and Kieran. You can check them out over at their namesake channel, The Kieran Show, link on screen. And I do recommend you give them a follow and a sub. Check out their regular discussions, their mad 40k army 24-hour build challenges. But as far as I'm aware, they spotted this first. Back in 2022, when the Warhammer community team were speaking more about the potential Henry Cavill situation, at the bottom of one of the related community posts, they attached this half-ruined Aquila, the Imperial Eagle. This was the same Aquila posted by Cavill himself from his social media account, and then we saw it again on the Era of Ruin book. Now, while it remains entirely speculative, it's quite hard to ignore the fact that this Aquila only appeared in a post related to the Cavill series even before the Era of Ruin was confirmed, and then now we saw it on the book itself, which leans towards suggesting that Amazon could well be basing whatever the series they're working on upon this Era of Ruin theme. Why else would you include that? Which makes a lot of sense. It would most certainly have a strong Custodes lens. There would be a lot of Heresy talk, which allows world building and establishing existing lore parameters, but without actively having to do the Heresy, which obviously would be astronomically expensive and almost impossible to do in terms of its scale. the Emperor would be also out of sight, which is something I would imagine they very, very much want to do. Keep him as sort of this invisible entity that is spoken about remotely. It'd be very much still a very dramatic setting, but as I've noted before, it could well be very confusing for newcomers, which has been the issue, of course, with Dune as well. So while speculative, I've found this very, very difficult to ignore, because until now that symbol of the Aquila really only appeared in 3 forms. The Unification and Crusade era Raptor Imperialis, which featured that single eagle head with lightning bolts, and that evolved into the Palatine Aquila seen in use by Space Marines in M30, M31, which now has a twin-headed eagle and also still those lightning bolts. Then, post-Heresy, they began over time to use what was now and would remain until M41, the Imperial Aquila, representing the various departments of the Imperium, and also symbolically that one blind eagle. The only other Imperial crest in common use is the Imperialis, seen used by Space Marines and elsewhere, say among the Imperial Guard. That's the winged skull, which I think is just simpler to say it has a variety of meanings, but it is effectively an army badge representing just loyalty to the Emperor. But what is not at all commonly seen is this artwork of a half-decaying Imperial Palatine Aquila, which, given its scarcity, really makes it fairly straightforward to draw conclusions from. Anyway, it's relatively concise to speak about, but I think very possibly there is something in this, because you just don't see it anywhere else. Swinging back into the Era of Ruin though, we return to a world where the Emperor now is placed unmoving upon his throne. The traitor Primarchs have been scattered, all that is left is the aftermath and the scouring to come, which I firmly believe we are on the cusp of, but it remains to be seen if that will actually be the direction things take. There are more reveals soon, so perhaps this is where things will go. Now, hold off on your comment, because that's what I originally wrote for this script, but as we just saw, it's now confirmed that the Scouring will be expanded into, which not only makes all the sense in the world, but it's extremely exciting. There is a lot to explore in the Scouring, and there's no question why it should happen, not least though because we'll get to see what occurs with the Legions, the Primarchs, confrontations like Dawn and Guilliman. There's very obviously extremely minimal information about this yet, other than it will clearly be a multi-novel series like the Siege of Terror, I would imagine, and it's only my speculation, but I would guess that that's going to involve a couple of novellas as well, and this is what we sort of see here with the artwork. It's pretty much what you would expect. But understanding that the Scouring is coming also adds more weight to this Era of Ruin anthology. Confirms what I've already said, which is that I like to often hold off and wait for a little more context, but especially if a story is not well defined or contextualized clearly. That's not really the case with the Era of Ruin, but, nonetheless, generally in 40k I find that additional framing is beneficial. The Era of Ruin does give us some shockingly specific details as well, which is not typical for most material. Usually things are just kind of implied. But the opening stories in Era of Ruin are vague and more general. They are just addressing the question of what did the end of the siege feel like when the vast vortex of power was consumed in that psychic backdraft where we saw the death of Horus. What remained in the aftermath? We have broken Marines wandering the destroyed landscape, loyalist, heretic. In some instances it's difficult to differentiate between the two. Only Astartes who had endured and found themselves upon the ashen wastelands and the ruined debris of terror would be able to tell. I think people had expected Era of Ruin to be more of a hard-hitting, explosive summary to the events that had preceded it. That's certainly what I expected, and I won't lie, I was initially a little disappointed with the pace and clarity, and I heard that from others as well. But this is the reason why I often don't post immediate reactions, because in my experience you need time to digest, reflect, contextualize material, especially when it comes to the lore, in my opinion. Era of Ruin, I believe, was in fact more of a meditation on what and who remains. It sets the tone and the scene, the transition from one era to another. The Crusade and the Heresy is over. The Emperor has been placed upon the throne. Those who survived must find their own way. And this is what we feel, especially in the beginning. Interestingly, they segmented the book by 2 clear quotations. And normally, with most Black Library material, you may have a heavy prologue or a quote at the opening to a novel. You may have small quotes at the beginning of every chapter. In Era of Ruin, the book is clearly divided into the stories within the section of the first quote and those following the second. And whether this was a deliberate structural choice or not, I don't know, but that's how I interpreted it anyway, because within the first section, the stories feel more about those who survived and find themselves in the wilderness. They seem lost, they've got no real sense of what may come next. But before we delve into the narrative shape of the text itself, it's worth stepping back and acknowledging the wider context which surrounds its arrival. For many, the end of the Siege of Terra wasn't simply the conclusion of an arc, it was the culmination of a literary journey. The Heresy series is over 50 books. It shaped a generation of readers, writers, and hobbyists, and it defined how the lore would become so deeply stratified within 40k. It was also just a fascinating concept in the sense that we knew the ending from the very beginning. I've always joked that people complain about spoilers, but the biggest one of all, that the Emperor dies, was always known. I guess that makes the entire Heresy like one gigantic Columbo episode in many ways. But it is intriguing to consider how that knowledge informed the tone of the material. You're approaching it in some respect with a sense of mourning right from the beginning, but this is stacked against the extreme anticipation of understanding with each piece a larger element of the entire puzzle. I don't think that the Era of Ruin arrived as just a footnote. I think of it as more a cross-medium transition. The literature, the miniatures, the setting itself, all are pivoting. It is not a triumphant opening to a new age, nor an epilogue to the last. It's more the silence that sits between, which might sound a little bit over-dramatic, I admit, but I think that's what it was really intended to be. And in that sense, it's not really aiming to please anybody. It just exists in that space. Lastly, if we're talking about expectations, post-Siege, these are very obviously innumerable. For me, in the Scouring, personally, I'm looking for gravity and fallout. What I mean by that is the final trilogy in the Siege of Terra, The End and the Death, were truly amazing books, but they also felt like a warp-crazed journey, which in many ways they were. I've not really read anything like it in my life because of the sheer saturation of detail, the fact that many of the chapters were quite short and it would go between one thing and another, and you had to keep all of this stuff in your head, lots and lots of moving parts. There's just so much happening, characters fulfilling their arc, revelations of history, descriptions of Terra itself effectively being consumed by the warp and the palace unmaking itself. It was a very wild ride, and often just so much happening, it's hard to keep a clear track in your mind, which is one of the reasons, again, why I haven't kind of covered it, because I think having read 3 gigantic books, I actually need to go back and then sift through them at a granular level, which is, not particularly appealing, it's got to be admitted, but that is roughly what I will plan to do at some point, and I would be probably interested to do it. But I think that's why the Era of Ruin exists, to create that space. And what I want to see beyond that is some sense of grounding, literary gravity pulling us back to the reality, and then the brutal fallout, the rage of the loyalists, the bitter spite and venom of the traitors, each attempting to find their new place in the galaxy, the shattered ideologies, the emotional wreckage of those who survived. What I'm saying is that if Era of Ruin was necessary detoxification, a tonal choice, that's fine, but it also really refused to answer the question of what comes next. And that's a question which absolutely must be answered in whatever form follows in the Scouring. Guilliman, Dawn, all the other Primarchs in the aftermath, the reforging of the legions, the beginnings of the Codex, I think the administrative and strategic discussions between the vacuum of power struggles which are going to exist is where I want to see things go now. And that can be beautifully juxtaposed with brutal heretic hunting carried out by seething loyalist marines. There's so much to explore, and I'm very excited to see where things go. We've spent years, decades in fact, watching the slow fall into darkness. The Heresy was never going to be about winners and losers because we already knew the result from the outset. So it was about what 40k does best of all, truth being bludgeoned into myth. The Era of Ruin does not attempt to dramatise what is already known, because why would you need to do that other than fan service? Instead, it's a long process of making sense of what came before, through the trauma, disillusionment, and the characters who no longer know how to make sense of the reality they exist in. Because if the siege ended in this firestorm, then the era of ruin begins in the ashen fog of personal ambiguity. The first section of stories begins with the quote, "Pity the dead, pity that they will not see the ages to come and all the wonders that their acts have wrought." The words etched on the stones of remembrance, the Dome of Unity, the Imperial Palace, Terror. The quote is exactly the sort of thing you'd expect to see carved into a vast marble monument column within the Imperial Palace, except its purpose is less to document than it is to comfort those who need to believe that all the suffering and loss had a purpose, a memorial to the fallen of Terror. But when we think about it within the context as we understand it, it reads less like reassurance and more like dissociative delusion. Because the deaths, the sacrifices, the obliteration of entire cultures have not wrought wonder, not the promises of the Golden Emperor, no new age of enlightenment. They have fashioned merely an extension of survival, and barely that. The three opening stories, Angels of Another Age, Fulgurite, and Fragments, are not a celebration of victory. They show us what remains when all the grand drama and mythos fall away. There's no great struggles for a defensive line, no battles for the Saturnine, no immense Dark Age machinery of war, no Primarchs locked in bitter combat. All has ground to a halt. In the first, Angels of Another Age, we see the horrifying aftermath of the great battles. The Astartes are utterly broken physically and mentally, their bodies and armour just ruined to the bone. They're blackened, they are remnants of what they were. Kaistos Gilon is one such remnant, a single shard fragment of a legion that no longer understands itself. A blood angel caught in the maelstrom of the Black Rage following the death of Sanguinius. The story is not for glory or heroic last stands. It's not about purpose or duty or serving the Emperor or the Primarch or just doing what must be done no matter the cost. We simply see the psychological collapse of one of the Emperor's angels. A figure who once Imperial servants would have knelt to, served, tended him to his maximal efficiency. But he is no heretic, no traitor, no renegade. But he also has no future. For any future which exists now has no place for him. His sacrifice dies in darkness, unrecognized and unwanted. His death will not save anything, not buy more time, not hold the line for one more hour or day, because there's nothing left to save now. The war is not over, but his part in it is already forgotten. I personally really loved this first opening story. It reminded me very much of Censure, because it captivates and captures that core truth of grounded reality for the Astartes, in nothing glorious, nothing to be carved into the Imperial Palace. Instead, it's just, these things are for the living who must lie to themselves about what the dead achieved, as per that opening quote. And people are constantly saying more than ever, where's the grim darkness in 40k, 30k? Well, I mean, it's right here. This single small short distilled everything about the sacrifice, the horror, the dystopian, bleak darkness of the age of the Imperium which it now enters. You see this human raised into a superhuman form, honoured, respected, but now totally discarded. They're just left raging, rampaging, slashing through the mud and the filth and the detritus, the blood, walking on into darkness. And as we learn soon, there's no salvation, no one to save them in death. The Emperor, as ever, is a lie. This crushing darkness, the hopelessness as we leave Gilon, waging a singular personal crusade into the abhorrent monsters that come to him. It's very dark and it's very somber, and it's a great opening. Then we come to Fulgurite. Now, Fulgurite is a culmination of Nick Kime's saga surrounding an array of themes and topics, but primarily Vulcan and the namesake Fulgurite. Now, Fulgurite is not a weapon nor a ritual artifact. It's not a tool of strategy. It's a scar. It's also referred to as a lightning stone, which I think some may recall could be connected to the church of the same name, in that infamous short, The Last Church. It seems very likely that the foundational object of that church, said to have healing powers, was in fact a remnant of the Emperor's power, which makes all the sense in the world, hence why he felt the need to ensure its destruction. And when the Emperor unleashes his full psychic presence anywhere, the warp becomes this conduit for pure destruction. He's channeling it, focusing it. And upon earthing that psychic lightning, Fulgurite is formed. Glass-like shards are left behind, the crystallized memory of the Emperor's distilled psychic energy. This story, though, is a final chapter for one Barthusa Narak of the Wordbearers Legion. Although outwardly aligned with his traitor brethren, Narak's true loyalty and journey always remained with the Emperor. He was wounded in the outbreak of the Heresy conflict and would then be tasked with retrieving an ancient artifact, the Fulgurite, primarily because these shards of the Emperor's lightning are believed to hold the power to kill even a Perpetual or a Primarch. Narak secured the Fulgurite through contact with the Cabal agent, John Grammaticus, and by now he was determined to prevent the Wordbearers' descent into corruption, and so he resolved to recover the Fulgurite and use it to kill Lorgar. So Narak still believed the Emperor to be the true divine being, as the Wordbearers once felt, and so he thought if he could destroy his own Primarch, maybe he could reduce the severity of the Wordbearers' fall, maybe even salvage something of the Legion. His quest took him to many places, Macragge, where betrayal by his own brothers forced him into hiding, but he succeeded in locating Grammaticus, and Narak was wounded again and ultimately subdued by Conrad Kurz. He was later discovered near the body of Vulcan and imprisoned by the Ultramarines, wrongfully accused of the Salamander's Primarch's murder, but would then be freed through an agent of Malcador, and joined a band of Salamander survivors attempting to return Vulcan's body to Nocturne. Middle, he found himself fighting off loyalist and traitor alike, to where he finds himself upon the surface of Nocturne, where he encounters who other than Eldrad Ulthran. And this is a time where the Cabal is still a thing, which I won't go into explaining again, but Eldrad recruits him to eliminate any remnants of that organization, after the successful conclusion of which Eldrad gifts him once again with a fragment of the Fulgurite. Narak is then able to reinsert himself among the Wordbearers and plans to use the ongoing invasion of Terra as a means to reach Lorgar. But he is unfortunately unaware that Lorgar had already been banished from Horus's ranks. So then we come to here, Fulgurite in the Era of Ruin. Narak in this short is wandering the destroyed wilderness of Terra, and the atmosphere is just great because despite him being a wordbearer, it's not immediately clear among anybody who is encountered whether they're a traitor, loyalist or deserter, which I think speaks very much to the atmosphere at the end of the siege. There's just utter abject confusion, chaos everywhere, not literally, and nobody knows what is going on, and in some instances time itself is still attempting to resolve into regular order. And despite near-fatal wounds, Narak is saved by one of the loyalists and continues his search, following what he believed to be the psychic pull of the Fulgurite. He's accompanied by a ragged band of ordinary guardsmen who've attached themselves to him in the hope of survival. But they're set upon by bizarre, twisted beings, and they manage to escape into a bunker facility, but Narak is wounded. He awakens to find the humans having patched him up, and they're now wondering what to do in this abandoned facility. But he feels sure that he can sense something still within this place. So they decide, rather than going outside to their deaths, to descend into the underground facility, but unfortunately what awaits them inside is little better than the outside. Within they find Fabius Bile, who in the eyes of Narak has entirely lost his sanity, and to be fair, Fabius had already begun to heavily disconnect from the standard of order of things even prior to the heresy. But at this point, he is all but fully converted into the nightmare genius he would become much later and through to M41. So Narak and his group are set upon again by another of these weird creations. They barely escape with the aid of the rabble guardsmen at his side. Once again in the wasteland, Narek and his group press onward, but eventually he encounters Erebus. And this is where he will meet his end. It was all a deception. Lorgar, of course, was never here. Erebus says a lot of Erebus things, and I'll just use the opportunity here to say this. I often find that many people have a good understanding of the Sons of Horus, the Night Lords, the World Eaters, Death Guard, the Word Bearers, though not always so much. But in the same way that I find people do not understand the Ultramarines, because what defines their goals and their driving force is not particularly clear at the surface level. And so, to this end, I would suggest checking out the Primarch series novel Lorgar, Bearer of the Word. The Primarch series in general is very, very useful because of how much context they all provide, but with Lorgar's one, it really digs into the core of who he is, and also you have Corferon as well. But if you do go and check it, you're going to want to do the audiobook or Black Library ebook version, because if you want a physical copy, you're looking at £50 to £100 on eBay, as is tradition. Fulgurite, though, is a nicely succinct end to the tale of Barthusa Narek. Interesting also that Erebus is still here on Terra, despite the world being in its death throes in the aftermath of the Emperor's battle with Horus. So you see that the traitors did not just flee like bugs under a rock as soon as everything was finished. And that's one significant takeaway. The other is the possible glimpse in the final wording, and that is perhaps suggestive of Narek being a true loyalist despite everything, maybe headed for the salvation of the Emperor. But that's something which remains still entirely debatable. So then we come to the third, Fragments, which stays within the tone of the first two, but Dan Abnett strips it back here. There's no legions, no all-consuming endless war. It's about survivors sifting through the ruins and trying to remember what the Heresy, or indeed any of this, was all supposed to mean. We see through the view of a silent sister, Aphone, and she describes to us the lonely isolation of what it means to be a blank or a null, not wanted by anyone, not even your own family. And so she spends her entire life in isolation. Much like the first, this describes to us the end state of the conflict, staring into the ashes and wondering what comes next. The story's title is very apt. For nearly all who survived the Siege of Terra, all that remains are now pieces of a reality that had stood before. There's a devastating loss of hope. Aphone cannot even imagine the future that will replace the one she had, until now, believed in. It's again a very short story, but one which felt to me much like loyalists screaming into the void. There's this sense that, although having achieved a technical Pyrrhic victory, they're just utterly broken. There's a moment in this one where Aphone is holding a traitor's head and just stands screaming, "Look at me!" And what you, probably not that deep of a voice though, what you feel is the sense that loyalists have become all too aware that in the new age of darkness, no salvation is coming. There's just this sense of overwhelming exhaustion. Without the Emperor to lead, there's a consolidating sense also of failure, even though they technically were victorious. But as with the End and the Death and the Siege of Terra series, I think to fully understand why they land so heavily, you have to have been able to place them within the broader arc and series of the Heresy itself. I often say how with the Heresy novel series, you can read the first 5, and then after that, what you want to do, whether you want to jump around or read it all the way through just straight, it won't really matter too much, apart from obviously some which are a series. But with the Siege of Terra and into the Era of Ruin, it's a bit different. I think you really need the context from what has led to that point in time. It's why I wouldn't recommend somebody just start with the Siege of Terra personally. I think you at least need to get those first 5 books and a few others to then come into it, because there's just too many specific details which would be meaningless. And so in Fragments, as with the Angels, you get that strong sense of despair that can only be felt in the shadow of that epic series. I don't think you would feel these short stories strong enough if you didn't have everything that which went before. Because the betrayal of Horus was not simply about just some military revolt. It was more like an orchestrated ideological collapse. The war began as a rejection of the Emperor's secular, human-centric vision. Horus and his followers were just consumed by arrogance, the hypocrisy of everything, the contradictions, the impossible burdens of expectation, and then the imperial truth. Lorgar, and of course Erebus, in his search for meaning, tore open the veil of chaos. Horus and Mortarion just walked through the door. Fulgrim fell into the pits of impossible excess, and Perturabo turned against the very ideals of order that he'd once upheld. Kurz, I think, basically just imploded and was trapped by his own nightmare of reality. I always think Kurz kind of just trapped in his own head and kind of just, like I say, he goes mad and kind of implodes. Then you do have Magnus, but he remains still, for me, something of a question mark. Yeah, he broke the Emperor's great work on Terra, but he gets a pretty raw deal, as we've discussed before. The Loyalists, though, weren't immune to just becoming twisted by the descent into darkness either. You've got the burning of Prospero, which, not a victory really for law and justice. The Dark Angels were, and remain, riven by internal division. The Iron Hands shattered themselves, Vulcan was broken, remade and lost, Salamanders just despair. Guilliman and Dawn were both consumed by the very best and worst traits of themselves, and then of course Sanguinius, compelled by fate. So that all in all, by the time the Siege of Terra begins, the Heresy had already significantly hollowed out both sides. The aftermath reveals painfully that slow death of idealism. Every victory at the smallest scale for the Loyalists is Pyrrhic. Every traitor put down is too high of a price. The walls of the palace are not just broken by the physical siege, they're buried under the weight of metaphysical deception, corruption, and the impossibilities of the conflict that is placed upon them. The death of Sanguinius, the wounding of the Emperor, the destruction of entire genetic stockpiles and billions dead. The final conflict of the Heresy saw the unrestrained trauma of a species tearing itself apart. And so when Horus is finally slain, the momentum carries onward. It doesn't just stop. It mutates and calcifies. And so what we know will become the Scouring inevitably begins not as justice, but as a purge. And this is what you feel in Fragments. The Sister of Silence has nothing to tell now, other than just her own story. There isn't a greater story, and she rages against the void that has denied anything more. So now we move into the section which I've titled Revelations, because the first half of the Era of Ruin is more about eliciting an almost undefinable feeling in the aftermath of what just occurred. So I won't ramble on at length about that, but obviously the Siege of Terra and what occurred with the Emperor is horrifying. Many are struggling to process that or find a way forward. And there are those who are more coherent, more ordered and grounded. They're able to remain strong in the face of the abject suffering and the shock and grief that is occurring. And to be absolutely clear, that qualifies for the traitors as much as the loyalists with the loss of Horus. The quote leading into this section speaks of flashbulb memory and a memory of sudden vividity. And that's what we get into in this section. It's descriptions of the aftermath, but with more clarified moments of vivid detail, unusually so. In Ex Libris, John French delivers us a small moment with Ahriman of the Thousand Suns. The way the entire piece is described is fascinating because it still deals with the fact that within the palace, reality and time have become completely fused together, overlapping, out of sync, as was described in the other books in the Siege of Terra. Essentially, as with the warp, reality doesn't exist here in this moment, until it does, and everything snaps back. The descriptions unfold for us to learn how the Chaos Gods poured so much power into Horus that defeat became all but unthinkable. That where the Emperor understood the possibility of failure and was able to prepare as best he could, the gods of the warp could not foresee the spoilers in the form of Olp, John, Loken, and also the pure faith of humanity. The raw power of the warp gods unleashed should have been enough. It should have been irresistible, unstoppable. But it wasn't. They failed to foresee that power, especially in humanity, the bargain that would bind the Emperor and mankind together for the next 10,000 years. One cannot exist without the other. One of the most interesting parts for me is when Ahriman is having a powerful vision, allowing him to see the totality of a momentary instant: Terra, the battlefields, the palace, the ships in orbit. And it states how, from his vantage point in the Riptide, Ahriman sees it all, sees the singularity at its centre, the whole in existence that was once Horus, a vortex, a spiral of unmaking. It will not last. It is an instant, a vast, an echoing instant of eternity. When it does end, there will just be dust and the echo of silence in the souls of the survivors. There's continued to be debate about if the Emperor fully deleted Horus from existence, as was stated in the very old 40k lore from 1st edition. As things stood at the conclusion of The End and the Death, people opined about how it now appeared that Horus was killed, yes, but not extinguished from reality. His remains were there. But this description from Ahriman seems to contradict that. Make of that, of course, what you will, but the language is quite specific. A singularity at its centre, the whole in existence that was once Horus, a vortex, a spiral of unmaking. And I'll crowbar in here my point about perspective and context being everything. If we only had the view of the traitors in the immediate aftermath of Horus's death, you'd imagine he'd just been killed. From Ahriman's point of view, it appears to be significantly more than that, even if his physical body was recovered. And there are other elements which speak to this shortly as well. But I'd also cover myself here and say there's a note merely a few paragraphs later where Ahriman describes how, is anything he sees or senses now real, or is it all in his mind? Is there a difference? Does the difference matter? 40k. And if that doesn't underscore my ongoing point about canonicity, I really don't know what does. An explicit statement about an event already established, but then immediately undermined by self-doubt from the character about their own lucid vision just moments later? It really gives you a headache. Ultimately, Ahriman considers how, in the end, Horus still won, which was very much how the Cabal had seen things also, that win or lose in the technical sense, there was seemingly no way for the Emperor to really beat Chaos, or at least not at this moment in time, which is very key to the contemporary era of M41 and potentially what could be occurring with the Emperor. System Purge is an exploration of the challenges facing both Mechanicus and Loyalist in the aftermath of the siege. Many core facilities have been penetrated and compromised by the traitors, which, as the title suggests, requires complete purging before there can be any thought of rebuilding and recovering Terra itself. Something that undoubtedly is going to take many years given the scale of the destruction. We follow Amagos and Techmarine as they enter the bowels of the Lionsgate spaceport. They're hunting for problematic scrap code that is believed to have been introduced by the Iron Warriors during their short control over the facility. The Lionsgate spaceport was never just a landing zone, it is the artery that feeds the Imperial Palace. It's the gateway to Terra, and brought everything to the surface. It's the only port capable of handling Imperial-scale vessels that are kilometers in length, and so during the Siege of Terra, this made it an absolutely critical piece of infrastructure to fight over. Because whoever controlled it controlled the planet in many respects. They could land supplies and material power. It was a gateway to either damnation or salvation depending on who controlled it. Dawn understood that if the traitors took Lionsgate, the rest would just follow. No carefully warded labyrinthine corridor, no fortified bastion deep within the palace really mattered if orbital superiority was breached. And so it was turned into this fortress. And the fighting, as we know, was apocalyptic, as was everywhere. Drop pods, titans striding across its concourse, hammering into one another, traitor masses sweeping like a wave to break against Loyalist defences. It switched hands multiple times during the siege, but ultimately Lionsgate was just barely held onto by the Loyalists. Its survival was essential in that it brought them time and bled the traitors. It blocked the most direct path to the throne, and as long as it stood, the palace and Terra itself had a chance. Just a sliver of a chance. And that was enough. In the aftermath, though, the spaceport remained critical still. Terra had been besieged and now urgently needed supplies. It needed aid and support. Like everywhere, the traitors had embedded themselves so deeply into the infrastructure of the planet that despite Horus having fallen, the remnants of contamination are still everywhere. And System Purge explores this, and notably what we get is another look at just how early the Obliterator virus was present. While the Obliterators are described and more prevalent later in Imperial history, we now see one of its earliest iterations. The Tech Marine and Tech Priest hunting this Dark Mechanicum scrap code find that what has embedded itself into the spaceport terminals is fundamentally different than any other they've seen. It's manipulating things at a genetic and programmed level, and at one point, just a random terminal attempts to penetrate and embed itself into the Tech Marine, which absolutely terrifies him. It's a scene which I can only describe as Akira-like. It's not an overly complicated story, but it is one which gets to the core of what faced the Loyalists in that aftermath, before, in the end, the Obliterator, of course, is revealed, challenged, leading to, as the title suggests, System Purge. After the Dawn opens with the same depressing stagnation, no shelter, post-traumatic stress, the scars of battles fought with the most horrifying weaponry available to humanity since the descent into what had been the Age of Strife. We join a man in one of the many refugee camps which are now all over the Imperial Palace and likely Terra itself. It's a way for them to centralize ordinary humans so that they can best care and utilize them as a resource. But this individual is caring for a small child. We also see some mocking about the beginnings of the faith in the Emperor, the cults that are beginning now, and the fact that now things are not quite as desperate and critical as they were before. It's okay to joke about "he protects." We hear also about the potential for the descent into inhumanity among them. They're keeping record of all persons. There are so few supplies that starvation is a real factor. The man we follow is even fearful that some might steal the child as a food resource. This man is Katsuhiro, who appeared throughout the Siege of Terra series and began as a lowly bureaucrat from Hokkaido Hive, conscripted with barely any training, armed with a single lasgun, and from there thrown into the chaos outside the Hideos Gate. He fought all the horrors that chaos could throw at them and somehow survived into becoming basically a veteran amid all the terror and betrayal. And his character is another one of those really good ones which just brings everything down to a human level. You're seeing just ordinary civilians basically who are on Terra when the Heresy comes to the door and they're pushed into basically conscription. Katsuhiro would later be transferred to the Palatine Arc, where he merged with Euphrates Keeler's religious movement that was growing. He took command of a desperate militia also at Marmax Bastion after the death of a Blood Angels officer, and they survived wave after wave of traitor assaults. His fear gave way to zealotry as their survival seemed impossible, as we were saying a minute ago, and he helped to spread the Imperial cult in that context, even encountering Loken while protecting a mysterious infant that had been entrusted to him by Shiban Khan of the White Scars. He would also join Keeler's exodus from the Sanctum Imperialis to reach the Hollow Mountain. Now this short, to me, had a lot to say in terms of what it was trying to illustrate. And again, I'll speak to some of it, but I don't really want to spoil everything. I felt that it also added to the general sense of just apocalyptic situations we're seeing in the aftermath. I think most notably I was reminded of P.D. James' Children of Men, which also explores these themes of authoritarianism, petty, jobsworth bureaucracy in dire situations still, faith, mortality, the fragility of civilization, using the absence of the children as a lens through which to examine human meaning and purpose. And just as in the aftermath, here, where so many people are starting to question what is the point of anything, The collapse of hope, it's a descent into a world that's just tearing itself apart, and as is noted by one of the guards overseeing this refugee camp to which he finds himself in, he says how this is the singular child within this camp, or an indeed that anybody has seen for many weeks. It must be kept alive at all costs, for it is the only source of hope. Also, just adjacent, if you've never read Children of Men, recommend that to you, because in my opinion, whilst the movie is visually powerful, the novel is far better. It's more reflective, thoughtful, it's more philosophical, and as is common with these sort of things, a novel gives more space for deeper exploration of what it means to be human. You get some of that also here with Katsuhiro. Eventually at this refugee camp, some Astartes arrive, Ultramarines. I was expecting some kind of powerful situation here to occur with them, but no, evidently they're here just to kind of monitor things and ensure that they remain peaceful. The people, though, are still considerably fearful. Astonishingly, and as the characters themselves are surprised to hear, the Administratum are still somehow able, amid everything, to maintain and track records of the survivors, which is really quite surprising given the situation. Everyone is required to work in clearing and organising the ruins to already start moving things forward in a constructive way, and in return they are getting their rations. A guard, though, reminds Katsuhiro that if he wants to keep the child, he should ensure he gets a ration card for it, not just himself. And he tries to bargain into not working so as to look after the child. And then here's where you get this great struggle between the bureaucracy trying to maintain an absurd, infuriating sense that we've all experienced. Someone with this attitude of, look, sorry, it's out of my hands, I can't do anything for you, when it absolutely is not. The scribe who Katsuhiro has to deal with basically says, look, I can't help you, I can't give this kid a ration card, there's no procedure for it, and he ends up really forcefully persuading them to do so. Fundamentally, he just says, look, if you're not going to look after this child, then what the hell was the point of any of this stuff that we're doing? And he really has no answer for that and has to just kind of crack. And it's just, that's one small part of this story, but it's a good example of what they're trying to get to here. It's speaking to the purpose of everybody, the endeavours. If you're not fighting for the child, for the potential new member of civilization, then what is indeed the point? And although the scribe bends to this argument, it still seems to physically pain them to do so using whatever rationalization they can. There's a lot of insinuations of the beginning of faith also penetrating through to all the human remnants, which isn't that surprising considering what they've been through. As I said, I don't want to reveal all with these stories, but you get to see the clearance effort occurring, ruins of the battles, we see the work parties, they're given water to drink whilst they're out on detail, but it's clearly irradiated, which shows that they're really struggling to find just decent resources. And again, it reminds of many apocalyptic dramas like Threads or The Handmaid's Tale, where human remnants are just left to clear the destroyed rubble of a new apocalyptic reality. But consider the insanity, if you will, of an empire as powerful as the Imperium, and they're using barely healthy, exhausted refugees to clear the Imperial Palace. When a traitor Marine is discovered here, they have to leave a 10-meter radius around him to allow for special clearance. In all of these tales, it's the small details which are particularly interesting. And Katsuhiro gets a good resolution in this story. It's one of the few which leaves you with a feeling that maybe darkness will not consume all, and the Astartes have just as much of a human part to play as do the humans who have survived to see the all-consuming scale of destruction. In some respects, I could make an entire 60-minute discussion about Homebound, and despite its humble story, is perhaps my second favourite from this anthology, because of what it represents and how it speaks to the broader history of the Emperor's grand vision, and its ultimate failure. For the purposes of this video, it is more simply a story of humanity. We reunite with Ilya Ravalian, a decorated general of the Imperial Army that we met in Warhawk, and also Sujuk Khan of the White Scars. As everywhere, the confusion and chaos of the Siege of Terra has not ceased, and while it's clear the worst of the fighting is over, rumours continue to swirl about just precisely the fate of the Emperor, the Primarchs, the Great Enemy. There is significant confusion, of course, no detail available. Some speculate the Emperor is dead, even Malcador. Some say this is impossible. He's surely only wounded at the very worst. Guilliman is here, claim others. There is now nothing to fear. The speculations about who is where and what is going on and who remains in command are just endless, but ultimately any and all of it could be true, or none. For most ordinary humans and their commanders in the aftermath of the siege, none of these answers would be clear for weeks at best, maybe even months for those depending on their relative position and access within the palace complex and other areas like the spaceport. I wanted to keep this one more spoiler-free, so I won't go into the specifics of some aspects, but she does greet some important figures while remaining within the palace itself. But I wanted to note that once again, it is described how Horus is destroyed, that his soul has been annihilated, and that there is a shock even that the Emperor actually had the strength of will to see that carried out. Now, as I've said so many times, when a single fact begins to become reiterated multiple times by multiple different figures, this is then what starts to confirm for me as it not being canon, but being established. And I think that's become my go-to term for just lore things and how visible and present they are. When it's very clearly established, it's all but set in stone, whereas things which are less established maybe have been just witnessed or described by a single figure or it's seen in a dream. These are still open to interpretation or change. Ilya ultimately leaves the palace on a ground transport, but practical issues of survival become this immediate concern, which I very much enjoy that being noted. Because think of it, you're in this barren, annihilated wasteland, thousands of miles all around, no logistics. The only food and water you can find are from destroyed convoys, patrols. You're basically a scavenger. The thought of that necessity alone is of course horrifying. No issue if you're in Astartes, but a regular human, you could be looking at mere days to death if you were isolated and far from a supply line or access point. We again see this disturbing emptiness and silence of this new reality that continues to be compounded, as does the sense of immense despair and frustration. She returns to her home city, finding it also, quite obviously, decimated. And this was when I began to really invest most in this story, because it reminded me of some elements within Valdor, Birth of the Imperium. We're presented with this rare insight vision of what ordinary humans still had in this time. It's a lot of memory and descriptive language. She finds her home, she's emotionally shattered by what she finds. It's a very human moment, something that I think can be very difficult to find amid the scale of the conflicts and the stakes in the Heresy, or even M41 for that matter. Again, I want to mention the Warhammer Crime series here because it is almost exclusively human-focused, set on a hive world. It's very worth your time. But for Ilya, we get just the most human of moments. She sees her home ravaged by the war. She remembers it from her childhood, how it was clean, ordered, there were plants and peace and friends and neighbours. It's a different age entirely. It also really, as with the Valdor novella, becomes this final glimpse of human life in this era before the age of the Imperium, that end period after unification, but before, obviously, the conclusion and the whole heresy. It's where human civilization still resembled something that is more recognisable from our perspective. I don't want to speak to the end of this one. It's a beautifully written piece that really evokes the spirit of humanity and what has been lost from the Crusade through to the Scouring. She, like so many others who gave absolutely everything they had to the Emperor and his great vision, is simply left now to contemplate, what was it all for? Now, I've seen people speak to the fact that the Carrion King really is the standout piece from this anthology, and it is, but that's certainly not to speak less of those we've covered which came before. It's just that when you have a custody speaking directly about the Emperor and Malcador and revealing truths and information long questioned, then it carries significant weight. And again, this is why novellas and short stories sometimes do contain elements that for whatever reason are just totally absent from larger mainline novels. Why that would be, I couldn't tell you, but there it is. Now, I said I would speak to Malcador today, and this is what it concerns. First, Lord of the Imperium. It's one of my favourite shorts, as you know, and I like to throw it out at people coming into 40k because it messes so significantly with the general perception of things. And in many ways it still does, because it's not in the mainline lore of the Heresy. Not to mention that originally it was an audio short, which for a good while is just totally off people's radar. So it's a really interesting kind of subtly adjacent piece, which people find through their 40k Heresy journey. Now in First Lord, we have one of Malcador's aides toward the end of the Heresy, Sybil Nasta. She is dying. Malcador arrives and appears to take this opportunity to drop something of a truth bomb on her, and reveals that the Emperor always had planned for the Primarchs to turn traitor into a civil war, but that things had gone badly wrong. Now, the troubling part is, after she dies, Malcador says how it pains him to have to lie to spare them, and it breaks his heart. Now, I'm not going to rake over this too heavily because I've discussed it before. The long and short is that for many years people have dismissed this entire scene with Malcador as, oh, he's just telling her all that stuff because whatever reasons before she dies. None of it's really true though, because he says he wants to spare them from the truth, so it can't be correct. Except, and I feel almost stupid in saying this, that obviously makes no sense. What is he sparing her? The truth that what? The Primarchs turned and that it wasn't planned? Isn't that better? Isn't it worse that the Emperor planned to turn them against one another and that was always the plan? So the entire argument that he's somehow sparing her by giving her a false, much more painful scenario that's extremely traumatic right before she dies? It makes no sense at all. So what's actually going on? Well, in my opinion, and I feel pretty strongly about it at this point in time, it seems very clear that what Malcador tells her about the Heresy and the Primarchs that the Emperor planned for the Heresy to occur, but just that they underestimated when and how powerfully Chaos would get involved, that things spiraled out of control too quickly, and then you got Magnus who really drops the ball. It's all pretty in line with the Emperor. He's basically doing Thunder Warriors 2.0. Why do you think in the Siege of Terror series we have the horrifying figure from the Dark Age who's creating a weapon that we can guesstimate is basically a virus capable of exterminating all Astartes? So when Malcador says he lies to spare them, he's not talking about what he just said. If anything, he's using a dying aide to just get all this off of his back, because he can't exactly go around just chatting to people about this. It must be an immense burden for him, on top of everything else, to just carry that weight of knowledge around. And here he sees an opportunity to finally share, which is so very human. And he couldn't really even tell this to anybody else, not anybody else dying. She is a trusted aide, she's in a secure location. He has an opportunity to basically vent, and that's what he does. So it's not that. What Malcador is lying about is when he says to her just before, he says, "Go to him. He will catch you," meaning the Emperor. I've long speculated that this entire spiel about the Emperor saving those who are most loyal or faithful is a load of nonsense, because the only thing that exists in the warp is chaos, and it consumes all souls, human, the Eldar, and so on. Except this connects also to what I've said before, that some souls are stronger than others. The Eldar souls seem almost indestructible compared to humans, which by comparison basically dissipate the moment somebody dies. And for those who do have stronger, more persistent souls, that's no good thing. You're going to be tormented for eternity in warp hell. So Malcador is lying not about all the stuff he said, just about the fact that the Emperor is waiting to catch those who serve him. It's a little twist on the human need to just believe something awaits them in the afterlife, which is all very ironic considering the Imperial truth and the emergence later of the Imperial cult. So then, where does all this connect with the Carrion King? Well, Diocletian, from his time wandering the palace in the aftermath of the siege, states how, "I try not to judge, truly, but I'm so sick of their prayers. I'm so tired of hearing the people scream and shriek and mumble and murmur of an afterlife at the Emperor's side. Their prayers reach our ears even here, creeping, spreading, an infection of faith overcoming the species. I don't want to enlighten them. It isn't malice that motivates me, but in the name of the man they believe is a god, I wish they would cease their wailing. We know what happens when a soul leaves a body. The fortunate enter swift oblivion. The unfortunate are the playthings of demons. Forever. It is the fundamental truth of reality, and the one thing our king never wanted the species to know." And this is just more confirmation that human souls enter the warp to disappear forever. They're consumed by whatever intangible energies exist there, and also that the Emperor really doesn't do anything to stop this. As Diocletian says, the Emperor really didn't want people to know that. Although that then raises additional questions for me, like why? Was it because he had a greater long-term plan, the whole "I foresee myself becoming a true god"? In terms of Carrion King itself, the general tone of Diocletian is very disconnected from reality, and with fair reason, because the Custodes at this point, not only are they immortals, but they're now left with no purpose in a realm of mortal concerns, which I think is quite comparable as an analogy to something like Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen, in the sense that his immortality would leave him being separated from humanity in a way that only an immortal figure could be. They become just bored of mortal concerns. They're tired by the endless desperation, the complaining, the griping, the struggling. And we see this also with some Astartes who just become detached from their mortality as a consequence of their own immortality. Now, of course, we know Astartes are not really immortal as are Custodes and Primarchs, but they are practically so. It's just that most will die in battle before entropy can totally consume them. Now, within Carrion King, it's also basically confirmed that the Emperor reached into the warp and used its power, if not in a deal with the gods, then in such a manner that it triggered them into acting, and he needed to do this to create the Primarchs. Again, that's a very specific detail which has been speculated about forever, and here it's all but basically confirmed. Diocletian also is raging at Guilliman and the Primarchs for what they have done, and that they're basically individuals of the Emperor. They're not shards of him. People have often said that the Primarchs are kind of individual aspects, they're shards of the Emperor. And Diocletian says, no, yes, they are of the Emperor, but they're just not shards of him in that sense. And so each push their own individual, specifically arrogant beliefs that each one can see the true path forward. What this means is that it's entirely questionable if Dawn's path, for example, would have been any more or less beneficial than Guilliman's was with the Codex. It's always been presented that Guilliman's plan with the Codex to dissolve the legions essentially and so on was the only way forward. But the way that Diocletian talks about it in Carrion King, you get this sense that not really, that perhaps really any of the Primarchs could have presented an equally acceptable plan, and that it would have been as good as, or certainly no more of a higher risk. Diocletian seems to be blinded by frustration at just how things have unfolded, which is fair enough. But also for a Custodes, he feels a little unobjective. For example, he unreasonably states how he's incensed that Guilliman did not leave for Terra sooner, when it's well established that he was trapped by warp storms. He had no reasonable way even to know if Terra even still existed. He goes on to talk about how the warp gods would now even be proud of the Primarchs, and he ascribes a lot of blame to the Primarchs themselves. He casts them in a cold light. The fact that the Emperor was, for example, not their father, just a scientist, which of course is something we see throughout the Heresy series. But at the same time, he's also ignoring the fact that the Emperor created the Primarchs. He also made a conscious effort to treat them, maybe not with the specific wording, but he definitely treats them like sons. And that's something, again, I've spoken to. It all feels very disingenuous on the part of the Emperor. But then Diocletian again reinforces this concept that the Emperor always kind of knew that things weren't going to go well. And the argument really here is, why would the Emperor create the Primarchs if he didn't trust them? And then why create 10,000 golden custodies to surround him as bodyguard if the Primarchs are so great, so trustworthy? It reinforces this idea, as Malcador states it, that the heresy unfolded entirely as expected, but perhaps just sooner. Because Diocletian is of course entirely unaware of that, but it underscores the legitimacy of his idea. Why do you need a vast army of Astartes killing custodians if your Primarchs are so very perfect and the fruit of your own creation with no concerns whatsoever? And I think the answer for that is quite self-explanatory. We progress forward to an undetermined period where Diocletian is now observing this new reality for humanity. The imperial religion has consumed everything, and it's interesting to consider and see from the perspective of one existing through these ages. He doesn't really seem to feel or sense time in the mortal way, which makes all the sense in the world. He walks past sites within the palace complex that were once dedicated to information and learning. He cannot remember even the last time he passed there, but now they've become chapels and halls of prayer. There are humans begging for scraps from the immense golden figure. It's just this very dark, depressing age now, and we've entered into, of course, the decay of humanity over the next 10,000 years. Diocletian describes how even the bones of the sacred fallen are looted by zealous preachers, believing the soulless sisters be tried even in death. It's this disgusting, unimaginable, twisted reality that the Imperium and Terra has descended into, and the Custodes seem fairly unbothered by this. They're so still consumed by grief for such a long time, they just kind of wander around the palace and don't do much of anything. Most critically, we come to the final vision of the Emperor, perhaps the most clearly described vision of the Emperor ever revealed. Until otherwise contradicted, this stands as effectively how we must see the Emperor from here on, and it's this classic Emperor decaying, a husk of a humanoid form hooked up with pipes, fluids, misting sprays, trapped in the eternal scream of death and life, a cycle of consumption that stays the final end and the death. I tried to consider what artwork existed that most resembled, and bizarrely, I think it's the first edition piece. This seems most similar to what is being described here by ADB, and I feel that perhaps it's very deliberate, that over the decades renditions of the Emperor and the throne have become ever more grand, embellished, over-the-top, romanticized. But although a little janky due to the era it originated, it's this image which remains perhaps the most true. Because for once, it actually commits to delivering us some hard information rather than vague insinuations or allegories. It's just Diocletian describing to us his thoughts, memories, and vision. But there is a caveat, of course, which is how these things are delivered. Which brings me back again to, of course, how well things are established in 40k. Because some of what's spoken to is unfortunately delivered to us from Diocletian's thoughts, memories, and visions. Which means, as always, this is being delivered to us in the meta-diegetic, one of the more unreliable forms of information in 40k, which is not to say, of course, that it should be just discounted, but it means it's less reliable than the author describing it to us specifically. Which is not to say, of course, it should be just discounted, but visions and dreams of a character are less reliable than an author describing it to us as an invisible narrator. And especially given that much of his descriptions are memory, again with the caveat that the memory of Custodes is near to flawless. And on that basis alone, I think it merits being bumped up to being more effectively just diegetic information, not unreliable mortal memories. But I think that's up to each individual person to decide for themselves how much reliability they want to place on that. But what I truly enjoyed was this snapshot of the slide into darkness. Diocletian describing for us the pain of being a Custodes as the centuries and the millennia pass. Much as Guilliman is discovering in M41, the insufferable demands of the faithful become very quickly intolerable. And I think for me, that remains one of the most comical and bleak aspects of the 40k narrative, that for all these grand, eternal wars, the literal horror unleashed upon humanity in the contemporary Imperium, But across those 10,000 years, there remains this dark, overarching narrative that despite the superhuman efforts of the Emperor and his legions, they couldn't prevent humanity from dragging itself back into the darkness of spiritual worship, the thing they sought, seemingly, most to avoid and punished most harshly. And now, for example, Guilliman knows he cannot go against that because it would just create too much instability. It would basically create a whole new civil war, which is something the Imperium cannot avoid. And if anything, in his time since he returned, Guilliman has even started to see signs of things which have made him suspicious and curious about the ecclesiarchy and this faith in the Emperor. But of course, much of this only applies, like I said, if you subscribe to a viewpoint that the Emperor was very sincere about what he was doing in the Crusade and the Heresy, and that he was not looking to set up as some kind of long-term master plan a situation that would enable him to rise beyond the form of just an exceptionally perpetual, powerful psychic mortal, and rise into another state of eternal godhood through the creation of faith. And perhaps he had foreseen that the only way in which he could do that would be this disastrous end to the heresy. That's very, very, very speculative, but it is a possibility. And as Malcador said, we wanted them to turn against one another. And that my failure was in underestimating the true enemy. The war began before we were ready. So as we enter into the now confirmed era of Scouring, there is a significant amount of material to explore. The traitors trying to consolidate their forces, the bickering conflicts that will erupt between them, those who are committed to a singular god, those of Chaos Undivided. And of course, interestingly, some of this is semi-established, as we've already had flashbacks and visions from the traitors in M41. But what is less established is what happens to the loyalists in the aftermath. We all know the fables of the Primarchs, lost in the warp, killed, vanished, and so on. But now we should get more flesh on those bones. And perhaps most interesting will hopefully be the formation of the Imperium out of what had been an age of hope into what it would become, a new empire of faith. The survivors who remain are not victors. They're more akin to administrators of decline. The custodians, as we saw and know, retreat into becoming basically isolationists. They're broken and just without any sense of direction or purpose for the longest time. The Space Marine legions are broken, but in a different way. They're separated into chapters, not out of efficiency, but out of fear. Much as we saw with the integration of Primaris into existing chapters, but it seems likely this would be problematic and painful for the Astartes as well. Then there are those who will actively resist the change, the Imperial Fists, the Wolves. What of their challenges? You got Dawn and Guilliman, and that's going to be something very special. Let us not forget also the rise of the Inquisition, the ecclesiarchy born from the ashes of faith. Obviously the modern ecclesiarchy doesn't happen for many thousands of years, so you're not going to see that, but at least you'll get to see the bare bones beginnings. The Emperor's corpse and terror itself becoming an object of worship, the dream of the Great Crusade is sealed forever behind the religious dogma of the cult. I think my final thought is that the era of ruin brushed away the smouldering ashes of the heresy to prepare for the scouring and whatever else may follow. The quote upon the Dome of Unity becomes part of that machinery. It's the new norm for the Imperium. Quotations, honoured memorials that are a useful fiction, a way to turn any failure into fuel, to mourn the dead without admitting that what they died for was already a lost cause, a foregone conclusion. It's this slow descent into the darkness of a dystopian Imperium that becomes an unstoppable bureaucratic machine. The real horror of the heresy is not the battles or the betrayals, but as the Emperor himself saw, the closer they reached the event horizon of the greatest battle ever fought, the knowledge that none of it could have played out any differently, that every character acted within the logic of their programming, biological, ideological, spiritual. The legions built for obedience, Primarchs for their raw power at any cost, and the Imperium for suffocating control. The Heresy was just a natural consequence of that system breaking under its own weight. When Fulgrim became obsessed with perfection, when Curse descended into madness, when Horus stood in the Emperor's sanctum and made his final choice, none of that was unexpected, even if those who were taking part felt as if there were choices still to be made. So yes, pity the dead, but not because they could not see this future. Pity them because they believed that there would be one. Pity the living more because it is they who must now construct some semblance of constructive meaning from what little is left, carrying the Imperial banner forward, not out of hope, but out of blind obligation. In the end, Era of Ruin is not about what was won, it is about what cannot be recovered. It is about the weight of survival, for the Heresy inevitably would always end not with triumph, but with tragedy and a pause. The bitter silence before the release of a 10,000-year scream.